Okay, I want to talk about some things that maybe some people aren't aware of. So, when I was affiliated with the myredbook.com Republican felon mob Herbert family, their entire house in Los Altos on Waverly Lane was like one big dump. Even though they had tons of money, their house was one big dump. There was one room that literally from top to bottom, front to back, side to side, wall to wall, just crammed with garbage. It was just garbage. And when you went in the kitchen, I mean, it's no different from how things are here at the myredbook.com Republican felon chapel house. The floors of the kitchen in Waverly Lane were just covered in filth and dirt. And the kitchen table, piled from on top of the kitchen table all the way to the roof. Garbage. Just garbage. And the living room or dining room area or whatever you want to call it, family room area of that house on Waverly Lane, I mean, the carpets were just filthy. I mean, they were just almost black. And there was just this television that was probably from the 1950s or 1960s. These people had tons of money and couldn't clean their house on Waverly Lane. They had money coming out their ears. And they couldn't clean their house. And the courts, the myredbook.com Republican Santa Clara County court system, they just looked the other way. I supplied pictures to the myredbook.com Republican felon Santa Clara County court system of just how disgusting their house was. Santa Clara County didn't care at all. At all. Then, I meet myredbook.com Republican pretending to be a Democrat, corrupt attorney Jeff Feinberg at Reddit Head, whose dad co-ran and co-owned a life insurance company with Tony from the NFL New York Giants. Okay. Jeff Feinberg had his little apartment, or whatever you want to call it, in Burlingame. Just like the Herberts. It was just filthy as filthy could be. Super filthy. Just, I don't know how long he lived there by the time I came along. But I think he told me that the place hadn't been dusted or cleaned in something like 5 years. There were ketchup stains all over the walls. Like somebody had, purposely taken ketchup bottles and just dumped ketchup all over the walls. I remember that in the kitchen. The kitchen table was like literally the first kitchen table that my parents had at their house, which was from like 1970 or 1972 or 1973 maybe. And was like broken in half. The chairs at that table in the kitchen of that filthy apartment in Burlingame at 9 Clarendon, the chairs were just ripped apart, broken down, just sat by the broken in half kitchen table. There was just piles of dust everywhere. His dad co-owned a life insurance company with a NFL New York Giant by the name of Tony. And this is how he lived. I came along, and at the time I could walk. You know, my psoriatic arthritis had not been diagnosed yet. Didn't know that I had psoriatic arthritis, so, you know, I was fully upright and able to do everything that every other human being can do that isn't alternatively abled or disabled. So I cleaned that apartment on Clarendon in Burlingame. Like, I went to work, and I even pulled out the oven and the refrigerator, and it was just the filthiest, almost the most horrendous thing you've ever seen, besides the house on Waverly Lane of the MyRedBook.com Republican felon mob Herbert family. I mean, MyRedBook.com Republican mob Herbert family house on Waverly Lane had to take the cake. But what I'm saying here is that you people think that homeless people are disgusting. But these people that have money coming out their ears live like homeless people, quite literally. They're just as disgusting, if not more disgusting. And I'm not even going to call homeless people disgusting, because as a study that had been done around, I don't know, 2015 or so, I'm not sure, indicated most of the quote-unquote homeless are college educated. At least in the San Francisco Bay Area, in California, in the United States. The problem is with our darn court system and with the corrupt law enforcement. That's why people become homeless. Okay, particularly women. The majority of cases that are brought where there's, children involved, when there's custody involved, the majority of cases, even in this day and age, go look it up, are won by men. The courts don't care about women or mothers or people that aren't, supremely wealthy. When I was dealing with the Herberts, even though I knew I was infertile, and no one wanted to pay attention to that at any point. The courts only cared about the money. They didn't care about the fitness of a person to take care of a child. All the courts care about is money. Who has more money? Still, in this day and age, straight male men, and primarily Caucasian men, especially in the tech sector, are the ones making the most money. And the courts only care about that. They don't care about anything else. Furthermore, coming back to this house in Santa Clara, I mean, once upon a time, there were supposedly NFL San Francisco 49ers partying at this house. Once upon a time, supposedly, the dad of these two ex-mafia members ran a delicatessen in Mountain View. So what I've seen is that the wealthy and supremely wealthy, they're no better than quote-unquote homeless. They're more disgusting than quote-unquote homeless. They're filthier than quote-unquote homeless. And it's not acceptable. And it's just, people need to understand that, just because there's a lot of money doesn't mean that, they're really any better than anybody living in a tent on the street. Okay, and as far as drugs are concerned, let's talk about that. It bothers me to no end. Okay, we're going after people living in tents, saying that, these are horrible, rotten people and they're using drugs and, just they're worthless, right? That's basically how people feel about people living in tents, okay? Let's be honest. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got supremely wealthy people that are doing the exact same thing. Okay. Obviously, the MyRedBook.com Republican mob Herbert family, there was a cousin of MyRedBook.com Republican felon mob Herbert members George W. Herbert and Richard Lyon Herbert, Monterey, Seaside, Los Altos, La Jolla, Gilroy, Pennsylvania, that was a celebrity manager. May still be, I don't know. But the guy's wife gave him an ultimatum, said either give up the drugs and go to therapy or I'm going to divorce you. The MyRedBook.com Republican felon mob Herbert family, just tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of money. They had money coming out their ears. They had their property in Mexico. They had the property in Inverness, Marin, in Point Reyes, Inverness, Marin. They had the property in Los Altos. Then, come to find out that there's another property, or more than one, I don't know, in Arizona. The Aunt Jill and one of the other MyRedBook.com Republican felon Herbert family members have been living in Arizona at some point. And then these MyRedBook.com Republican felon ex-mafia members, Greg and Glenn Chappell, though we know those aren't their real names. I mean, they've got a guy calling himself David Jenkins, totally into meth. Then they have a friend calling himself Steve Johnson. Guy's done every drug under the sun. And, it's just ridiculous that we're going to condemn people living in tents for using drugs when most of them, in fact, are college educated, at least in the San Francisco Bay Area of California. when we've got supremely wealthy people doing the exact same thing. Let's talk about another real issue besides what I've talked about already. And that is that it matters to my Red Book Republican felon law enforcement who donates to them, especially in the San Francisco Bay Area and California. If you're putting money into the sheriff's office by way of donation or into, some corrupt police department by way of donation, you're going to get off for whatever you do. Whatever you do, you're going to get off as long as you're donating. Donations should be eliminated. That's one of the primary differences for people that end up in court. Not just if you are wealthy or if you are poor, it's how much you donate. In addition, it matters if you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent or what have you, Greenpeace, whatever, when it comes to corrupt law enforcement. The majority of corrupt law enforcement, they are all corrupt. They're Republicans. So if you're not a Republican, that's another nail in your coffin, so to speak. You don't donate, you're not a Republican, you're going to jail, you're going to prison, they're going to just come after you nonstop. Those are some pretty major things to think about and consider. And from my vantage point, where I stand, okay, my mother came to the United States not of her own volition, but because her family came here. She wasn't born in the United States. However, she did graduate from Stanford. She got her bachelor's in math in 3 years. She's a very smart cookie. And, I'm using my mother's kind of language, if you will. I'm using her diction, her syntax when I say something like smart cookie. She graduated from Stanford in 3 years with a degree in math, and she, tutored NFL Jim Plunkett in English. Okay, my dad, he graduated from the University of Michigan. He has a book in the Computer History Museum in Mountain View. My dad's books, computer books, have been used in places like Stanford. My dad has actual published computer books. Unlike my mom, though, my mom, her dad was an attorney. My dad was the first person in his family to graduate from college. But I come from a pretty privileged background, if you want to call it that. And I've seen everything. And like I said, from my vantage point, the difference between those that are living in tents and those that are living in homes. It's not the drugs. It's not the money. It's the principles. People living in tents actually have way more principles than people that live in homes. And people living in tents have way more principles than any corrupt law enforcement out there. People living in tents are actually 100 times less of a criminal than any corrupt law enforcement and anybody living in a house. Just those people living in houses and those people in law enforcement get away with their crimes because they're in law enforcement and there is that thin blue line. Or because, somewhere along the line, people living in houses, even as, big, even as much as they are super criminals, they acquired some money somewhere. And they learned that, if you donate to corrupt law enforcement, you're not going to have any issues. Or you're not going to have that many issues. And they learned that, if you don't talk about your politics and you don't tell them that you're, a Democrat or you're libertarian or whatever, if you don't ever tell anyone what your politics are, then the corrupt law enforcement that are in fact Republicans won't come after you as much. And that's the truth. Like I said, I've seen it all. I've been down there with people living in tents, and I've come from a privileged background. I don't use drugs. Never got into meth. Never got into, ecstasy to, a large degree and everything like that. Never got into heroin at all. I'll be honest, have I dabbled? Only because I felt like it was necessary so it didn't end up dead. Yeah, I've dabbled to not end up dead, pretty much. I mean, I don't want to go into another long drawn out discourse. But I've never gotten heavily involved in any type of drug. I've never tried heroin. Never got addicted to cocaine. Never had to have ecstasy. What other drugs are out there? Oh, LSD. Yeah, not my thing at all. Yeah, and that's just my take from having seen everything. And I understand, a lot of people just haven't known where I stand on a lot of issues, and, there have been people in my past that definitely have probably guessed, and I think I made some enemies out of those people. A lot of people probably assumed that I'm some hardcore feminist. I wouldn't say that I'm a hardcore feminist. But do I believe in equality for women? Absolutely. I mean, I have very strong women in my family. Okay, my mother being an example. She graduated from Stanford in 3 years in math. My aunt, her sister, my mom's sister, is a doctor. My mother's mother was head nurse of Sequoia Hospital in Redwood City, California, after they came here, after they came to the United States. My grandmother, she would go to a 10-cent store, what she called a 10-cent store in South San Francisco. And she would point to things at that 10-cent store. And the person that owned the store, or one of the owners, would tell my grandmother what everything was. That's how my grandmother learned English. So yes, I have some strong women in my family. That doesn't mean I hate men across the board. And as much as people want to label me as some hardcore feminist, why don't we turn the tables? If you want to label me a hardcore feminist, I'm going to label you a hardcore misogynist. So again, here's where I stand on the issues. I am pro-choice, even though I'm infertile. I'm an ally of LGBTQIA. I am against the death penalty because one person who's been put to death who is innocent, that is one too many people that has been put to death that has been innocent. I am also an ally of BIPOC and Indigenous. That's where I stand, just to be clear. And I think there needs to be definite reforms in terms of law enforcement. I think that donations need to stop immediately. And I think that we need to stop condemning people that live in tents, because they are literally no different than people that live in homes. They are, in fact, in my opinion, more principled and have more morals than those people that live in houses. And as far as bullying is concerned, that's a major reason for why people, opt out of the workforce or decide to leave high school early or decide to leave college early. And that's a major reason why people commit suicide and why, people, no matter where they come from, end up using drugs. So yeah, there needs to be some kind of attention paid to bullying. And as far as I'm concerned, my personal take is that yes, pot should be decriminalized all the way up to the federal level, and especially for people that have medical issues, like, people that have cancer, or, kids with epilepsy or seizure disorders. Kids with epilepsy and seizure disorders, or, cancer patients, like, absolutely they should have access to pot or marijuana. At the same time, my personal experience tells me that when you smoke pot or whatever, you eat enough edibles, when your eyes start rolling back in the back of your head, when they start rolling, I don't think at that point that you're capable of consenting to pretty much anything. I don't think you're capable of consenting to driving a car at that point. I don't think you're capable of consenting to sex at that point. That's just my personal take. It's my personal opinion. And that's all I have to say for now.